Hi, my name is Randy Agert, and this is a brief introduction to pragmatics. Definiteness. To understand definiteness, we first need to talk about what we call referring expressions, and I'll list the main categories. So there are pronouns like she, he, it. There are proper names like Fido or Lassie. There are demonstratives, like, for example, just saying that, and demonstratives often or perhaps usually are accompanied by an actual demonstration, that is to say, a pointing of some sort. They can also be used with common nouns in a larger noun phrase, like that dog. There are possessives, like his, hers, or mine, which act as noun phrases by themselves, or they can act as determiners, as in his, her, or my dog. And then there are definite descriptions, like the dog, versus indefinite descriptions, such as a dog, or some dog, or one of my dogs. You will often hear people refer to the as the definite determiner. However, that title of the definite determiner isn't quite right because it presupposes that there is only one definite determiner, but demonstratives, as we've just seen, like this or that, these, those, and possessives like my, her, their, etc., these also act as definite determiners. We can think of referring expressions as being on a definiteness hierarchy, where pronouns are perhaps the most definite definites, and then proper names, demonstratives, possessives, definite descriptions, and then indefinite descriptions at the very bottom. And we can draw a line there and say that everything above the line is a definite noun phrase, and everything below is an indefinite noun phrase. Then there's more of this cognitive hierarchy, the Givenness hierarchy introduced by Gundel, Hedberg, and Zakarsky in 1993. So there are going to be discourse entities that are in focus, that is, they are the topic of conversation at that moment in the discourse. Then there are going to be activated entities. Those are entities that have been discussed already in the discourse, but aren't in focus at that moment. There are familiar entities. Those are entities that presumably we are mutually aware of. All of the conversants in the discourse are aware of them. There are going to be uniquely identifiable entities. Those are entities that there's only one of, and so you can refer to it with a definite description because it is unique. And then there are referential, where we can use referring expressions to pick out some entity out there from the world by pointing to it with some sort of description, typically a definite description. And then there are going to be type identifiable elements. Those are going to be at the bottom. Those are just things where you're saying, for example, a dog, and you don't expect your addressee to know which dog you're talking about, unlike when you say the dog, where you assume that your addressee will be able to identify which dog it is that you're talking about, that is, that they will understand you as referring. And again, we can draw that same kind of line. Now, this isn't perfect, and there's been a lot of criticism of this approach, but it is, at least intuitively satisfying to think that there's the same sort of cognitive hierarchy to the linguistic hierarchy that I just mentioned in terms of definiteness. This is an area that I think a lot of people ignores the grammatical effects of definiteness. So, for example, definiteness is clearly at play in pro-drop languages. These are languages that can drop pronouns. The pronouns don't have to be overt or pronounced in sentences. So, for example, in Hungarian, if you want to say, here it is, all you have to do is say itt van. And there's no overt pronoun. You don't have to use the pronoun it, and in fact, it would be very odd to put it in there. So it's just understood, here it is. In Spanish, we would typically say, hablo español. You wouldn't add that yo in there, I. It's not necessary in Spanish, and so that I just gets dropped in I speak Spanish. And even in English, which is not typically seen as being a pro-drop language, in special circumstances, we can. So for example, you can walk up to a friend and say, hungry? And it's understood to mean, are you hungry? We also see the grammatical effects of definiteness in what are called direct inverse languages. These are languages such as the Algonquian languages, where subject and object are determined according to hierarchies of salience or animacy. In other words, they're not determined morphologically or syntactically. It's based on, a hierarchy at play. In direct unmarked sentences, the subject is whichever of the two argument NPs is higher on the relevant hierarchy. In inverse, that is the marked sentences, the opposite holds. So generally, you're going to assume that whatever argument is higher hierarchically in an animacy or salience, or as I'm going to argue, a definiteness hierarchy, then that element is going to be the subject of the sentence, unless you indicate otherwise, and that is that you have an inverse marking on the verb. Arguably, the definiteness hierarchy plays a role in such languages. I'm not going to give any specific examples from inverse languages, direct inverse languages, simply because I don't feel that my expertise is such that I can. I'm going to give you more of a general example of what this would look like. So for example, you would have some sort of third person inflection, probably inflected on the verb, and then the verb, say, sees, and then you would have another third person marked on it. And if the verb is either unmarked or marked as a direct verb, then it's understood as being something along the lines of he, she sees the other person. So in other words, the subject is whoever is in focus, using that animacy hierarchy we talked about, and the other person would be more of a referential phenomenon, where you're just mentioning some other individual. Perhaps this could be seen as somebody who was activated. On the other hand, if you put the inverse marking on that verb, then it flips it, and then it becomes the other person sees him or her. And I would argue then that that lines up pretty nicely with our definiteness hierarchy as well. And again, I think that's an argument for this sort of phenomenon existing cross-linguistically. Another place where we see these grammatical effects of definiteness are in languages where there's an indefinite inflection on verbs and a definite inflection on verbs. Hungarian is a good example of this. So, for example, if you wanted to say he, she sees the dog, you would say látja a kutyát. So látja is the verb see, inflected for third person. Notice pro drop there. There's no overt third person pronoun. So látja is inflected, though, with a definite verb inflection, meaning that its object is going to be a definite noun phrase, a kutyát, the dog in this case. On the other hand, if it were a dog, then you would take a different inflection, just simply lát. Lát egy kutyát. So now it's sees a dog, he, she sees a dog. And if you just say látja with that definite inflection on the verb, but no object, then it's understood, again using prodrop, as it, he, she sees it. Látja Attilát would be he, she sees Attila, and Attila is then the object. That's a proper noun, and that's considered definite. But this is the weird one. So in Hungarian, just purely grammatically, not for any cognitive reason, but for grammatical reasons, I, that is the first person, is treated as indefinite. So you get lát engem, not látja engem, which would intuitively be the case, but for whatever reason, conventionally in Hungarian, linguistically, grammatically, the first person is indefinite, not definite. And that brings me to just conventions in general. And one of the places we can see grammatical conventions is in idioms. And so going back to English, she let the cat out of the bag means she told the secret. But notice that if you said he let a cat out of a bag using indefinites, that doesn't mean to us he told a secret. That's just not idiomatic English. And so we have to just simply accept that there are going to be aspects of definiteness that are purely arbitrary conventions of the language. It's raining cats and dogs. Likewise, it doesn't, it means to rain really hard. We would never say something like, it's raining the cats and dogs with a the there. That's just not the idiom. And we could go even farther and argue that examples like I went to the store, where you're using it just simply to mean I went shopping, that the there is not a definite cognitively, it's just syntactically a definite. That's just, again, an arbitrary choice that when we mean it in that way, and we don't expect the addressee to know which store we're talking about, then it just means I went shopping. Similarly with you need to go to the hospital, we don't necessarily have any specific hospital in mind, a unique or identifiable hospital. We just mean you need to go get looked at because you're hurt. But that's the American way to say it. And this, again, demonstrates that conventional aspect to it, the arbitrary aspect to it, because in British English, we would say you need to go to hospital. Now, I think a obvious question here is, what determines definiteness? How do we know what sort of definite or indefinite noun phrase to use? Linguistic conventions, as I've argued, play a role. So, for example, that in Hungarian, the first person is just indefinite. There's no rhyme or reason to that. That's just part of the linguistic conventions. Likewise, for idioms that we just talked about, and I would argue generics as well, because some generics take a definite and some take an indefinite determiner. So the dog is America's favorite pet. We don't mean some specific dog, we just mean dogs in general. And likewise, if you say a dog is a loyal, loving companion, we don't mean any specific dog, again, we just, or some hypothetical dog, we mean in general. We're talking about a type, not a member of the type. Uniqueness is another element here. So the dog that lives next door to me barked until 1 o'clock last night. It's understood there that there is one unique dog that lives next door to me. And in that way, we are licensed to use a definite, even if I'm talking to somebody who's not familiar with that dog. The smartest dog in the world must be a Kai Ken. And here I want to make sure that it's understood that I'm not meaning this in a generic sense of, a type. I mean that there is one specific dog out there in the world that is the smartest dog in the world. I don't know what it is. I don't know that dog, but I presume that such a dog exists. So a superlative, by its very nature, indicates a unique animal or unique entity. And so there must be some dog out there in the world that is the smartest. And I am stating that that dog, whatever it is, must be of the breed Kai Ken. Salience, the dog has been keeping me up all night. That's only going to make sense in a context where my addressee understands which dog I'm talking about, understands that there's one dog that stands out among others. And here, we may live in a neighborhood, as my wife and I do, where there's quite a few dogs surrounding us, but I think that she will understand that there's only one that's likely to bark all night long, and that's going to be the most salient in this situation. Givenness, my dog is a Kai Ken, that only really makes sense in a situation where we assume that the hearer is already familiar with my having a dog. And so that discourse referent already exists for my addressee. Inferability. So if I say my dog is a Kai Ken, and then I say his tongue is purplish, the his tongue there is understood as a definite because you can infer from the existence of my dog that there is a tongue belonging to that dog. So there are some cases where we just sort of carry with it certain other potential discourse reference, and we can treat those as definites because they're inferable from already activated or in focus definites. And there's individuability. So that dog there, I could be pointing at a specific dog. In that case, it's understood that I am individuating that dog from perhaps a mass of dogs. I'm somehow creating this individual dog that you understand me to be talking about. In sum, definiteness is a feature of languages. It may be manifested differently in different languages. Not all languages, for example, have definite determiners. So how each language decides to treat definites, that may differ from language to language. Those are going to be the conventions of the languages. There is, though, clearly a contextual component to definiteness. That is, how we actually use them is going to be contextual in nature. And there does not seem to be a simple definition of definiteness. We can't just simply say these are the necessary and sufficient conditions for being a definite noun phrase. We could list them perhaps for a given language, but we can't decide what determines whether a particular entity is going to be referred to using a definite or an indefinite description. Definiteness may be determined by a confluence of factors. So, for example, I listed some elements that may come into play, like uniqueness, salience, givenness, individuability. And then finally, perhaps all of this adds up to identifiability. That perhaps when a speaker uses a definite noun phrase, they presuppose that the addressee can identify what they are referring to. And if they can't, then that's a failure in communication. But so when we use a definite noun phrase of any sort, a pronoun, a proper noun, a demonstrative, a definite description, anything like that, we are assuming that our addressee can identify what we intend to refer to.